back to the Holy Hardwood podcast with Pat and Tony. Your New Orleans Pelicans today sitting at 27 and 21. Pat, it's been a minute since we've hopped on here to have a chat, so it's going to be a good day to kind of pick your brain and kind of see where things are at on your perspective with the team over the last 2 weeks or so. But just want to welcome you back, and it's been a minute for sure. So glad to be getting on here again with you.
Yes, sir. Thanks for having me on, and it's always a good time when we can get together and chit chat based on what we've seen. Like you said, the last couple of weeks have certainly been interesting. There's been some good moments and some bad moments. I think the big thing is just how do you digest what you've seen and try to make a calculated you know feedback on what you're actually seeing, and can you take away any emotion and things of that nature. And obviously, we try to do our best when it comes to that, game in, game out. But the longer you go into this season and down this path, right? It seems like what you're seeing is kind of what you're going to get, and to expect a sudden change or um, improvement from the things that are giving this team issues are likely to not change over the next month or two. So certainly an interesting time, and lots to discuss.
Definitely, Pat, and I think you kind of hit that one, out of the ballpark. It's when you're early in the season and going and watching these games and seeing different trends and the up and downness of this team. We're over halfway through the season, and like you're saying, this is kind of the team that you're going to get, fortunately and unfortunately, depending on the things you like or dislike and all that stuff. And I think one of the bigger issues that we kind of started at the beginning of the year was just some of Willie Green's coaching, the rotations, some of the calls he was making late game, the adjustments or the lack thereof adjustments. And I think you've really seen that over the last couple weeks, where it wasn't as good in the beginning of the year, then kind of at that midway point, like 20 games in, I think some stuff kind of got hidden just because we had a winning streak there for a little bit, and now all the situations, like we're saying, the late game execution, and partly on the players for sure to execute late, but I don't think they've been put into great positions as well. So I think that's kind of my first takeaway on kind of where I want to avenue this podcast on, is just kind of your feelings about Willie Green's coaching, this year as a whole, and what you've kind of seen lately from this team.
Yeah, and I think that's a good place to start, right? I would say we've had an up and down 2 3 weeks, and certainly a lot of different things that you can look at, and there's been different things that have caused this team issue. But I think the most glaring and the most consistent is there's just too many questions on a night to night basis in terms of what's going into the decisions that are being made, that end up deciding who's on the floor when and with who, and things of that nature. And it's like the longer you go, you almost have to start removing any benefit of the doubt that you give Willie, that maybe we did earlier in the year. And like kind of how I started, it's like this is just who he is, and to expect a sudden change or a different approach, I think is just, it's not very realistic. And I think that's first and foremost the biggest concern right now. Um, you know the the biggest thing to me is Willie is a younger coach. He's been a head coach what now? This will be his third full year. Obviously, we've called out the fact that he's had to navigate some difficulties in terms of battling injuries and some of the Zion drama and things of that nature that certainly make it more difficult. But um, you know, in totality, this year this team has been pretty much as healthy as they've ever been since really the main four or five guys have been together on the roster. Um, and this is, I think, in my opinion, the worst job he's done of coaching the group, right? This is the best situation he's had during his tenure in New Orleans. And his night to night performance is getting worse and worse and worse. And I don't know if that's just due to the fact that maybe he doesn't have the ability right now as a coach to juggle having a fully healthy roster, right? When there are 2 to 3 guys in a pecking order that need touches or want touches or might think that they're their man or might think that they can provide a solution to help win more games. And I think that that's often overlooked when you look at really good teams and really good coaches is, it's not easy to juggle that dynamic of talent and egos and things of that nature in this league because to be a top 2 or 3 player on a team probably makes you a top 100 player in the world, and to be a top 100 player in the world, you're obviously going to have a level of irresponsible confidence that I think all three of those guys rightfully have. But it just seems like he's not doing a very good job of juggling that.
Yeah, I think just to go along with that is, you've seen, like you said, this team has been relatively healthy, and I think for me, it just seems that his feel from game to game or in situations, it seems like he kind of freezes, or like we've said before, he's gonna revert back to his defensive style. Um, recently we saw a game where we were, up against the Celtics, 8 minutes to go in the game. Uh, we're up eight, and there's a timeout, and my feeling is always, okay, that's when you get the rest of your guys in there, and that's when you put the pedal to the metal and try to take that team out and give them no confidence. They come out, go on a run. It's 2 minutes later. Now it's a tie ball game. The crowd's back in it, and you basically lost the game right from there. So, I mean, it's been very tough to just kind of see those situations game in and game out, especially when they've been those close decisions. We still haven't won a game where there's a point differential of 3 points. Last 5 minutes of the game, our record continues to be what it is, like 3-12 in close games when it's clutch time. So it's just hard to see for a team that's just so talented, and then they just keep getting hung up by this. Another trend that I've kind of been seeing, like you said, how he's, I guess interpreting these stars that we have, and there's this pecking order is since the beginning of the year. Your Brandon, your Zion, their production won, and their shot attempts or quality has gone down. So at the beginning of the year, they were at a set amount. In the last 2 or 3 months, Brandon and Zion's attempts have gone down. CJ's has stayed around the same the whole year consistently. Your Herb Joneses, your Jonas Valanciunases, and then some of your guys off the bench, those guys are getting more opportunity where it's kind of that kumbaya offense and good and great when you're winning the games and you're making shots and all that stuff. But it just seems like they get hung up whenever there's those really good teams like we've seen, like the Denvers, the OKCs, the Milwaukee's. Like it just doesn't work against those types of teams. And I think it's really put them in a deficit as of late because they're trying to play this team oriented offense, and everyone gets looks and touches and good and great, like I said again, when it's all rolling for you. But that's just not the nature of the beast in the NBA. I'm a believer of, you have to have your star and your next guy. Those have got to be your pecking order, and whatever comes after that, that's what people get. That's not to say that Brandon or Zion shouldn't share the ball or anything like that, but you have to have a clear motive going into each of these games. This last however many 35, 38 games that you have left in the season, and I think that's more beneficial for this team than anything.
Yeah, a lot of good little nuggets right there. Yeah, I mean, you raised the point of their record in close games and their performance against good teams down the stretch and things of that nature. And to me alone, I think that's pretty telling, right? I mean, this has been a team that routinely in the past 2 years, despite these injuries, have always matched up pretty well against the best teams in the league. They've done it. I would imagine if you looked at the stats, they probably were about average in closing out games, but we certainly weren't struggling at this level. And that was with less talent on the floor and less options to go to. Um, and now you're seeing this year, for the most part, they've had all three guys together. They've had a healthy roster for the most part, and they're struggling more than ever down the stretch of these games. When in reality, it shouldn't be that difficult, right? I mean, the more options that you have, and the different styles you can go to when you have a guy like Bi, Zion, or CJ, it shouldn't be that difficult to close out games, right? Now, I'm not saying that okay, it has to go to this guy every single night, because obviously defenses are going to change your approach and force you to do things that you probably don't want to do. But it's not as if they don't have a level of talent to the fact that they can't win half of these games, right? I'm not saying okay, well they should win 8 out of 10 games that are a 2 point game. Like that's very difficult to do, but to win zero of them, I have a hard time finding okay, it's just on just on the guys, right? Just on the players, because I've seen these guys in the past, whether it's Brandon alone or Brandon and CJ or Zion and CJ or Brandon and Zion without CJ. Like I've seen it enough times to say like they can close a game. They can win a game down the stretch that it's a 2, 3, 4 point game with 4 minutes to go. Like they've shown me the ability to do that, at least at an average amount, and to now just not be able to do it whatsoever, not one time halfway through a year, is very odd to me. And I think that I think you just kind of have to call it how you see it. I think the best version of Willie was whenever he was able to kind of sell this. We're going to band together because we're injured, we're compromised, we don't have enough guys on the floor, we don't have talent. He was able to kind of be that, you know, he was the guy that was able to keep everything even keeled, which helped that group as they were trying to survive that. But as you've seen him have an influx of talent and him having to manage expectations and, giving responsibility to certain guys, like you said, there really isn't a hierarchy. It's just kind of whoever has it going. And I think, to be honest, a lot of that has to stem from the fact that that's probably his messaging, because that's the easiest thing to say, right? I mean, it doesn't put a lot of stress on him, 3 through 13, if he says, "Oh well, whoever has it going, we're going to get them shots. If you've got a good look, take it," which is true in some aspect. But like you said, in reality, you're only going to go as far as your top two guys take you. Whoever you think those top two guys are, I don't really care, and it really doesn't matter, right? Everyone's entitled to their own opinion. But if they can't get you to the place that you're trying to get to, then it's irrelevant, because role players aren't going to get you into the playoffs. Role players aren't going to single handedly win series for you. It has to be your top one or two guys, and right now it's too much of, like you've said, right? It's too much equal opportunity, and it doesn't really seem like there's a strategic focus in, these are our two guys, and wherever the rest of the shots come, they'll come. And I think that's a lot of the problem. And I think a lot of it comes from the fact that I don't think he wants to have those conversations, because rightfully so, it's gonna upset people. It's gonna ruffle feathers, right? A guy like CJ is not gonna be happy to hear like, okay, you are permanently taking a back seat. Like you are not one of these top two guys. We are not building this franchise around you. You've got to take a step back. You need to take on more responsibility in terms of playmaking and taking care of the ball and managing the game. Like that is now your job. A guy like Trey Murphy right now probably doesn't want to hear that, because he feel like he's coming off of a big year last year. He had the injury. He was ascending, and he's trying to find himself, right? And that's harder to do when you have less shots and less opportunity. But that's just the reality. That's the, like you said, nature of the beast. And I think he is just unwilling to have those difficult decisions, because it's not in his nature. He's a very mild mannered guy. He doesn't get very emotional. And I think you have to have some of that. And you got to be a little bit of and I think a lot of it, you also have to have the confidence to do it, right? You have to have the wherewithal to understand, like, I'm going to take some pushback from this, but ultimately it's the right thing to do. And we can't get to where we're trying to get to without pushing these buttons and making these decisions. And I don't think he has the self confidence as a coach to be willing to take on that risk, right? I think he feels more comfortable just playing it safe, playing a little bit over 500 basketball, doing this, and wherever it shakes out, it shakes out. So um, to me, that's a big issue with the identity of kind of the makeup of the team. And there certainly are some issues in terms of just like the build of the roster that doesn't make it super easy, because you have um, a lot of guys that their skills overlap each other, right? You have a lot of guys that do the same stuff, and that certainly makes it different to like branch out from each guy. But yeah, I think it's a big issue right now with Willie, and not one that I'm overly confident is going to be turned around, because that's just like a big picture conversation, right? I haven't even touched on the things that you mentioned in terms of like his game management. It seems like he's always a couple possessions late to really being able to feel the game is shifting, and stopping the bleeding. And it's just I haven't been very impressed with Willie this year, and ultimately we'll have to see where this shakes out. Right, it's a contract year for him. His contract's up. He would need an extension going into next year. Um, so I mean, I think regardless, there's going to be a big decision to be made. It's either you're going to recommit to Willie and he's going to be your guy probably for the next couple more years, or you're going to have to go in a different direction and find a new guy.
From my perspective, Pat, I mean, it's to that point where it's like he's either going to step up and this team is going to get on a roll here and everything, but like you're saying with all the deficiencies, like you just can't know because like this is just kind of who he is. This is kind of how the team is, and my biggest thing looking at the team is it's kind of like a maturity thing. Like they can have these good games where they score 140, hit all these threes, or playing the way they want to play, but then the next game it's a total dud against a good team. Then after that they play really, really well and bounce back, which is really good that they have at least that part as a team of when they get knocked down, they usually bounce right back up in that next game. And I don't know, you just always see the well coached teams and mature players after playing a little bad. It's not like, okay, we're going to let 2, 3, 4 slide where we kind of saw this past week where, we kind of got hit in the mouth. Then it led into another game. It led into another game. Those great teams and those well coached teams, they bounce right back up and then they get on a, 4, 5, 6 game winning streak right from there. And I think that's just the missing part. We have all the talent in the world, I think, to succeed at the level in the NBA. It's just been these little things here and there that's been going on all year. And, I like to say would love to see the team get into, closer games. But at the end of the day, like if you can't figure out now halfway through the year how to finish out games or close out games, like that's a real issue because it either seems they're either winning really big or getting blown out. And then on the occasion when it's that close game, even when they've been up, like that Boston game, they were up 17. Same old story. Team comes back, they lose the momentum, lose a close game late. So it's been a roller coaster for sure, um, on that front.
Yeah, and I think that's a good jumping off point and a good segue into, I guess, maybe another talking point over the last couple, right? I think we're in agreement. I think right now the stock is about as low as it possibly could be with Willie. Um, it's up to him to see what he does and if he's willing to not only make a change but commit to a change, because there's been times where he's flirted with making adjustments but he always reverts back to making a poor decision and going with what he's most comfortable with, which ultimately isn't the best decision for this team to succeed. So I think we're in agreement there that if it were me, I wouldn't have Willie back next year. I think I've seen kind of what his ceiling is, at least at this point of his career. And I don't have the time to sit around and wait for him to mature as a coach and maybe evolve in these areas and grow and improve. Like maybe he does that down the line 2, 3, 4 years from now. But I just don't have the time on my current timeline to wait around for that. So I would have to be in the market for a different coach. But I think starting there is, I think there's some serious issues in terms of, you made the comment that you think this team is, very talented and, at least talented enough to compete at a very sustainable high level in the league. But I don't know that. I've that's changed for me. It goes back and forth, and I think it shouldn't be that difficult to stay as confident in the fact if they do have enough talent or not. Like it shouldn't change night to night based on what I'm seeing. Now they can play bad, or they can be not committed to one end of the floor or whatever it might be. But I don't see that high end talent that maybe once was discussed or once was mentioned. I think that's part of the problem, right? And a lot of that stems probably from the fit that you would categorize the more talented guys on this team. Their fit just doesn't go well together, and so for me, that's a big issue. Not one that I foresee being changed this during the season at the deadline that's approaching. I believe it's next Wednesday or Thursday, so less than a week away. I don't see major changes coming there, but I've seen this play out now. I've seen him healthy. I've seen him have supporting cast members play enough around him that it's time for me to move off of the big three, as you want to say, right? And there's different ways you could slice that and different approaches and different versions of that, but I'm to the point where I'm ready to move off of that.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting discussion to have, and kind of piggyback on you saying that maybe the talent level you might not see as much anymore. I think like the biggest thing is one, like you're saying, the three just doesn't fit together, and you've seen it enough times where there's a deficiency here or there, depending on if it's offensively or defensively with those three guys, them operating kind of in the same space. But I think a big thing that's kind of hurt this team is just the regression of Trey Murphy, hitting a really tough stretch here in the season and not been really shooting the ball well since he came back from that injury. He had maybe a week and a half, 2 week stretch when he first came back where he was pretty solid, but ever since then he's been in a real struggle. And I think he is obviously the X factor of this whole group, where he has the high end capabilities like we saw at the end of last year, where you're like, okay, we have the guy that could maybe replace CJ as that next guy on the team. And, with him being in this kind of rut that he's having, it's just making it that much tougher, for this team to succeed at that level. And so it's very hard, to talk about that. And, you hate it for a guy like him who was on that great progression and then ends up getting hurt and just seems like he hasn't found his groove. So, but I think, all in all, Trey Murphy is an X factor for this team and makes them that much better. And, that hasn't been the case. And I think that's where you've seen some of the struggles this year with the team.
Yeah, and Trey's an interesting case. For me, it's not. I'm not even really concerned with the shooting. It's bound to happen. Guys who are shooters, they go through slumps. It happens, and most of the time they always come out of it, and things shake out to be fine. But it's the other stuff with Trey. I haven't seen enough of a jump in terms of, just his feel. Pretty much, I mean, if he catches the ball and he can't shoot the ball on a catch and shoot, it's now gotten to the point where it feels like a dead possession to me. It seems like he's taken a step backwards in his ability to put it on the floor, and maybe some of it is, from that knee injury. And certainly don't want to mention guys' injuries and say, oh, well, they're not as bad as they are. But you know, it is shocking to me that it is taking as much time for him to ramp back up. I mean, it wasn't an ACL, it wasn't a 12-month injury. It was a rather short turnaround injury, right? I believe it was only like 6 weeks, like a month and a couple weeks. Like it wasn't to the extent where it felt like he should have taken as many steps backwards as it seems like he has, and that certainly is concerning to me, especially him being in a contract year, right? Like coming into this year,
And
you felt.
I thought it was very strange too. Like he came back and was playing pretty normal minutes and stuff, and then like halfway through, then now he's been on a minutes restriction for like a month.
Yeah, I think he was dealing.
That's a little odd to me too.
Yeah, and I think he was dealing with some tendonitis, what they say is typical, right, based on the injury that he had. But again, that doesn't go in the positive column, right? That's not a good thing, regardless if it's normal or not. It's deterring him from playing the way that he wants to play. And I think he came into this year as a guy that you would have deemed, almost a cornerstone, at least into the future. And like I found myself I'm closer to being able to put him in deals if I think it improves his team drastically, just because of the emergence of a guy like Hawkins, where you're not as committed to Trey as a shooter. Although it's great to have both of them if they're both playing the way that they typically play, but I also understand that like you have to give up things to improve the roster and do that. And he's not in a point where for me he's a no discussion, like he's an untouchable guy. Like if the right deal comes across, based on his performances this year and a contract year looming, I would move him for the right price. You're a couple months removed from he's going to be asking for near the max, if not the max, right? The first contract max. It's going to put him around $30 million a year, and it's the way he's playing right now. That could put you in a very, very tricky position. He's been a good player for 2-3 years, but I don't think he's been a incredible player. I think he's had spurts, and I think he probably has a body of work that's maybe a month to 2 months of like really solid basketball. But even I think at his apex, he wasn't a max player. He just was projecting to potentially be a max player based on his skill set. But we have not seen anything close to that. And like time is ticking, right? And I don't think he's going to be a guy like Herb that you're going to kind of get at a hometown discount. Like he's going to want to get every dollar that he can get, right? Right? You know, rightfully so. Can't hate him for that. But that's a very big commitment, and one that certainly becomes a lot more difficult to deal with if you get to the point where you do sign him to that contract. So, not to say I think they're shopping him, but I don't think they're turning down calls if a guy like that's been floated, a Lowry Markkinen or something of that nature, right? An all-star caliber player now. If you can flip a guy like Trey for him, I think that they should seriously consider that. And we'll have to see. But a lot of it just comes from those main three, and you can throw JV in there a little bit, but nowhere near as much as those three. Those three really drive the identity of what this team's going to do, and um, I think there's got to be some shakeup there, in my opinion. I really do.
Yeah, it's like you said, you have enough of a sample size now because the thing was that these guys hadn't been playing. You know, there was combinations of CJ and Bi, and CJ and Zion without Bi, and now the three of them have basically been playing, and they're pretty much a 500 basketball team, and that's very concerning. And like you said, I mean, if it's offensively them being in the same space, but defensively, I haven't been too impressed with our defense as of late as well, and I just don't really know the direction that that's going in. Yeah, we're rated. Our defensive rating is like top five, top eight, or something like that, and it just seems like it's been easier and easier for teams to get what they want as of late, and so I haven't been impressed with that. But yeah, I mean, I don't really even think that anybody on this team is untouchable. I mean, in your eyes, what would you do? You think there's a guy or a couple guys on this team that would be considered untouchable?
I mean, I think everybody's touchable, right? I mean, I think it's just like how realistic is it that you trade them, and a lot of that isn't based on their production. It's more just like time and place. Like I don't think it's likely any three of those guys get moved at the deadline. Um, Obviously, like if you're looking at it strictly from a basketball perspective and not from a like locker room or intangible or this guy's a grown up or whatever it is, like I think for sure the CJ experiment has run its course. Um, I think a lot of what you're seeing in terms of and it's not his fault, right? Like Brandon and Zion haven't done a good enough job on their own to take the mantle from him, and part of it is that like he still feels like he needs to play that role, and they haven't taken it, but they want it. So like there is some back and forth there that you can't put solely on him, right? Because they've needed him to play at a certain rate to be competitive, but I just think that CJ has too much on his plate. He wants to have too much on his plate. He feels like he's having probably a career year in his mind, his shooting splits and things of that nature. And it's not about his production in terms of that. It's just he squashes the opportunities and the responsibilities that you should be taking and putting onto those other guys. And right, it's not a good fit. He has done a great job of shooting the ball. But at that guard spot, if you still want to maintain a lineup with a Herb Jones, right, like, and a JV, or whichever direction you would go, you would imagine you probably aren't going to get more shooting at the five. Even if you made a deal, it would probably be more defensive versatility and athleticism and things of that nature, right? You've needed to have shooting at the one, which is part of the reason why it's more difficult to remove him from it, just because of the spacing aspect. But in terms of being a playmaker, valuing the ball, dictating pace, he's done a very poor job this year, and I think that's the numbers would back that up, right? And it's just I'm not bought into the CJ thing. I think I've seen enough of it again. I've seen kind of who he is. It's very similar to the Portland days where you flip on a game because you don't watch very many Portland Trailblazer games, and he has one of these games where he has 29, and you're like, man, CJ's he's a good player, and not to say he's not a good player, but I don't think he's an impactful player. He has games where he'll have 33 and he'll make 7 threes, and then you just look back and you're like, well, it didn't really feel like he had an impact on the game. And that I struggle with. I think also with him, you struggle with positional size with the current group. CJ is undersized. Zion is undersized for their position. So already there you're facing some difficulties that just you have to manage because of the construction of those three. So for me, I think that would be the most likely thing, just due to the fact that Zion is a high enough and talent and still young enough that I would imagine you don't push the eject button on it right away. So I think CJ would be the first one out, just because I think it gives you more clarity, right? Like I would rather take a step back and like in terms of not needing a third 20-point scorer, but as long as I had more clarity and defined roles in terms of guys in that starting lineup, I think that would be more beneficial because it allows everybody to kind of understand what their role and responsibility is each and every night. And then when that isn't done, like then you have a clear way to say like this person isn't getting this done or this guy isn't doing his job. And I think that's important. When you have too much of the same and it isn't like clear what my responsibility is every single day, it gets too easy to kind of like float in and out of like not focus, but like aggressiveness and things of that nature, right? I think if you don't have a CJ there, you don't see Zion and Brandon take a step back in terms of, oh, I'm not as locked in tonight, or I don't feel like I need to be as aggressive or take on as much responsibility. And I think that really hurts them.
Yeah, from my perspective, that's kind of bringing everything all together. And I'll just make the one last point on this kind of issue is, the really great teams and the coaches, going back to a coach, like they define roles from day one, and those are going to be the roles that those players, you know, are working on throughout the whole year. Yeah, given injuries, your role might change a little bit, but all the good teams, their players from 1 to 15 know exactly what their role is day in and day out. And I believe the Pelicans guys, one day it's this, one day it's next, one day it's that, like, and no one has a clear defined role of, like we're saying, there's not that hierarchy. It's the, good to say, hey, we're going to win as a team, lose as a team, we're going to do this as a team. That's good and great, and it's a good motto. But if you don't have any clear defined roles of saying, Brandon, Zion, you're our number one guy, you're our number two guy, and however you would want that, everything's going to be running through you, and then everybody else, picks up where they can, and you define, okay, Herb, this is what you do, this is what you do, Jonas, this is what you do, CJ. And I think there's just been too many, game in and game out, day to day stuff where our guys don't know what their role should be.
Yeah. And I see that too. And I think like a lot of it is like you would love to say, yeah, these guys are our 1 and 2, and that's the response. But the problem is it stems with CJ, right? As soon as they start, passing the ball to CJ and drawing to, and he starts hitting shots, he's not fine and comfortable with staying in that role as a spot up shooter or floor spacer. As soon as he gains confidence, rightfully so, then he starts taking on more responsibility, which then nerfs them and takes the ball out of their hands. And that's part of the problem. It's not as if he's a bad player. It's just it doesn't fit. And I think that's okay, right? Like it's okay to say that like at the time of when they got the deal, they needed sustainability and stableness, and he provided that. But I don't think you have to act like 3 years later it's still the right fit. It's not. So um, that's what I would say, and then after that, then you have a bigger discussion about the other two. But that's where I'm at. He's the one that I feel like is kind of the odd guy out for me, and you just have to see how you retool things and what comes available. But I mean, at some point, you have to make a change, and you have to start spending some assets because they're depleting, right? Like that war chest gets smaller and smaller each season that you sit on them and wait for them. So you kind of have to do what you can do now, and that's what I think will happen in the off season. I don't know who that'll be, but I would expect some major changes at the top. So
Yeah, I mean that's the question, and like you said, there's probably nothing that happens immediate by any chance. Just wanted to hit one other point, and then we can just move on. And it kind of goes with everything and how the Pelicans play. And maybe a little bit with coaching and how we're saying there's this kind of jam here at the top. But when you have, Brandon Ingram, 45th in the NBA in, shot attempts per game, and Zion's not even in the top 50, and then, CJ's closely behind Zion. I mean, that is your big issue where there's role players on other teams or like a sixth or seventh man getting more shot attempts per game than your two main guys. I mean, granted, it's difficult to get Zion, 18 layups a night just because he doesn't shoot, outside perimeter shots. But I don't know. I just feel like that the best way to move this team forward is you have to have your guys being aggressive, and that's partly on them. But you're not going to be winning too many ball games and succeeding far in the playoffs if your two main guys are shooting 14, 15 times a night.
Yeah, but again, part of that stems from the fact that guys are wrongfully slated on this team. You can't you the reason that this is why big threes typically don't work, because it's hard to find a balance there, and it's very difficult to keep that balance on a night in, night out basis, right? Like you look around the league, there aren't very many big threes, like true big threes. And if there are, say Phoenix, like if you want to call that a big three, the reason that that's able to work is because they have such a drop off when you go to the bench, right? Their rotation guys have such a drop off and have such a smaller plate of responsibilities that then those guys are still able to find enough shot attempts a night, and you don't deal with this like. And I'd be interested where the Phoenix guys sit in that number of shot attempts per game. I think you said Brandon was 45th. Like, where do those guys sit? But part of the problem is CJ shouldn't be he isn't a part of a big three. He shouldn't be listed as a big three person, right? That's outside of what he's capable of truly doing. Now, is he a good player? Sure. But he's 30 something years old and has never made an all-star game. Like, he's not a member of a big three. He's a good player, but that's it. But also the problem is you have guys that you still like in your rotation and guys that are role players, a Trey Murphy, a Jordan Hawkins, right? Like those guys still also need to take shots and they want shots. There's just not enough to go around. So something has to change. You have to either, like I said, couple the role players together and go and get an additional top level player, or you've got to move CJ out for a guy that has a better fit, and his, I don't know, I would imagine it's probably what, like 12 to 14 shots a night? Is that
14.
what is it?
CJ's around 14 and a half.
Yeah, so 14, 15 shots a night. If now you're then pulling out of that 14 or 15, 4 to 5 shots a night, though are getting split to Brandon, they're each getting 4 or 5 extra shots a night, and then you're spreading those extra five throughout the rest of the rotation, then it's fine because then you have balance. Then you have this is where our bread is buttered, right? Like a Boston. This is where you have a Jalen and Jason. And then after that, then it kind of sprinkles down, right? There's not a night where Jason is going to shoot the ball 7 times. That's just not going to happen, right? I mean, you have to you can't have that much, and I think it's because they've done a good enough job of drafting that like Trey is a high enough caliber player, and so is Hawkins, that they need the shot attempts, but CJ's also not good enough to like take away from those. They're too close. They're too close in terms of talent. There's not a big enough difference, so they all feel entitled to the same amount of workload, and just makes it way too scattered across. Right? I mean, we've seen it. The games where they've had more shot attempts, Brandon and Zion, regardless if they've played great or not, but they play at a better rhythm. They know where they're getting their shots from. They know the spots on the floor they need to get to. It's not just like, okay, I've shot, now I'm going to go be dormant for 4 or 5 minutes because I don't know when the next one's coming to me. It's not sustainable over 82 games. And that's where you get these massive ups and downs, is like, yeah, they look great because everybody got into a rhythm and everybody got to their spots that they're able to be productive. And they win a game and look really good. And then the next game, they look terrible and they can't score offensively. It's because there's too much differential. If they had the same responsibility every single night, yes, they would still lose games, but it would be a consistency to it. And that's where it feels like they're lacking a level of consistency. And I think the only way you gain consistency is by gaining clarity. And by gaining clarity, the only way you're going to do that is creating a structure that makes it very clear what everybody's role and responsibility is. And I think that that's what they need to do.
Yeah, I don't think you could have said it, any better than that. And I'll just I brought up or you brought up the Phoenix Suns guys, and I'll just put those stats up there for you. I mean, Devin Booker, he's top 8 in field goal attempts at right around 20 a game. Kevin Durant slowly behind, or right behind him in 12th in the NBA at 19.2 uh, field goals a game. And like you're saying, it's a different big three over there just because of what Phoenix has on the outside of that. And Bradley Beal as this so-called, third option on this team, he's having, 13.9 or say 14 shot attempts a game. But then the other guys on their team, you see it, 3 attempts, 4 attempts, you know, and that's just kind of the model that you look at these good teams where you're saying a Jason Tatum isn't going into a game and saying, "Hey, I'm only shooting 7 times." Like, I think it's pretty criminal for the Pelicans to go into a game or multiple games and then say, "Oh, well, we're just fine with Zion shooting this amount," or we saw a lot in January. We're fine with Brandon only taking 8 to 12 shots, and that's kind of what he averaged in January. I think that's just a disservice to him and their talents and their skill levels on basically making them now just any Joe Schmo kind of just
I mean,
middle of
they're
the
turning him
ground
into
just
role
player. Like I
players.
mean,
Everybody's playing
exactly
as role players.
like you've clearly seen Zion play at a level before in his career or Brandon at a level, but the fact that he's playing the way that he's playing right now, like that is just a disservice to both of their talents and abilities, and it shouldn't happen. And that's just how I feel about it. I think you have your best opportunities when you have, say, hey, it might not be 20 and 19 attempts that they're getting, but what they're doing right now is just not good enough. They have to be north of 17, 18. Like 18's fine in my eyes for Brandon to shoot a night. He's going to, the more he shoots, statistically, he gets better. The less he shoots, he kind of seems he's not in a good rhythm. He's not, into the game, so on and so forth. But I think that's kind of like the biggest thing that they might need to turn away from or try to figure out these next, set of games before hopefully you can get into a playoff spot and have that all figured out. But you can't just, like anything, just snap of the fingers and say, oh, it's the playoffs. Now we want Zion and Brandon to play like this because it'll be 2 months of, okay, we're not being aggressive. And then that just throws everything off.
Yep, I think we agree on it, and I think we agreed on a lot of things, and I think that those are the two big issues that they're facing, and they're not issues that are going to fix themselves, which is a gift and a curse, right? You have the ability to make changes that kind of force change and force resolution. So we'll just have to see if they go that route or if they stand pat. And I would imagine you're going to see, pretty much the same thing from here until the end, and it'll kind of wrap up in a disappointing manner, and I feel like an opportunity that you let slip away. So. Interested to see where they take this and where it wraps up and what decisions are made. But that's at least where I lie on these, and that's what I think should be done. So that's really all that can be said at this point.
Yeah, Pat, couldn't agree more with what you're saying. And, I'll just, say this before we kind of end things off. I guess I would ask you, do you think that there's possibly going to be a trade or something, around the edges that happens for this team? But before you answer that, this is kind of the dog days of the season. I get it. Players are already looking at that all-star break and everything like that. But I think this is a vital opportunity for the Pels, especially their next, 9, 10, 11 games where you have a little softer of the schedule. But again, nothing's ever guaranteed with this team. You look at the schedule and the teams that you have coming up, and you would like to think like, hey, this is an opportunity where in the next 10 games you can go 8-2. There's no reason why you shouldn't. You probably have the better team in 8 out of those 10 matchups. But again, that's why you play the game and that's why you show up. And you just really hope that this team is mature enough before this all-star break to handle their business here, especially with the San Antonio Spurs. But after that, the next week or two, you have a little bit of a softer schedule, like I said. So it'll be really interesting to see how mature this team can be and where they can go from there and hopefully get a little bit of a rhythm and win streak going into the All-Star break.
Yeah, agreed with the opportunity that's at hand, to get some games back, and they got to take care of business to do so. But like you said, we don't know how that's going to play out. We have to sit back and see how they perform. And then to the point of the trade, I would imagine something very minor will be done. And to be honest, it doesn't even matter. It's not going to have any impact on the real issues at hand. And if anything, it might even make them more convoluted depending on who that individual is that's brought in, right? It might even be an extra guy that you feel like you have to get shots for, and it just creates you know less of a hierarchy than we already have, which would obviously be very detrimental. So I don't know. If it were me, I would see that I've positioned myself in a pretty good spot right now, all things considered. I have a chance to make a somewhat of a run and push myself into the playoffs here, and I've got the assets to do it. And if it were me, I would make a bigger move. But that's why I'm sitting here talking to you, and I'm not pulling the strings. So
Yeah, no doubt about it, Pat. It's always good getting on here and talking a little bit, chopping it up. About our New Orleans Pelicans, like we always say. You know, I love being a fan, but it's also frustrating at the same time when you see the mistakes over and over again, and you just want to see this team succeed. And I think they've got some of the tools to do that. It's just some decisions need to be made for sure. But always love getting on here with you and just chatting it up.
yep, couldn't have said it.
Absolutely. All right, this has been the Holy Hardwood podcast with Pat and Tony. Thanks everybody for listening. See you in the next one.